Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible Quest. This is the Thursday. Oh no, I almost did that one. The Wednesday edition, where we have Jeff and Joe and Chase. I can't keep track of my days. Sorry about that, guys. If you're coming in watching us on YouTube, we'll keep an eye on the comment section. We'd like to hear from you with your comments, questions, things like that. Or you can go to BibleQuest.org at any time and give us your feedback or suggest things that you'd like us to talk about or like the panelists to talk about. So with all of that said, who am I turning this over to? You, right, Jeff?
I'll take it.
Good. Got it.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Drew. And I am Jeff Smeltzer in Exton, Pennsylvania. Chase Byers is with me in Fishers, Indiana. Good afternoon, Chase.
Yep. That's me. It's good to be here. I'm excited for this topic you have for us today, Jeff. It's something I don't really know a whole lot about.
Well, I'll tell you, and let's just mention Joe's not with us today, and we miss Joe, but hopefully, Lord willing, we'll have him back next week. But so, Chase, I don't spend a lot of time talking about, in my teaching or in my preaching, I don't spend a lot of time talking about this denomination, what's wrong with it, or that denomination, what's wrong with it. But there's a reason that I'm going to be doing this coming Sunday. I'm going to be talking about Seventh-day Adventism, and the reason really is because I think there's some lessons that we can learn if we go back and look at how the Seventh-day Adventist denomination came into being. It's not just to bash the Seventh-day Adventists. I clearly think that certainly I believe that their teaching is wrong. But it's not just to point out somebody say, well, they're wrong. It's to say there's some lessons we can learn. So I just want to say that up front.
Okay? Yeah, that's helpful. And yeah, that's people can scroll back through and see the Wednesday editions. This is a very rare thing for us to do, but it is helpful. Jesus and his apostles, Peter, said that there will be many false prophets out there, and that this is something we can come to expect. And so we got to learn how to deal with some of these things.
And in the case of the Seventh-day Adventist, there is a person who was regarded as a prophet, or in her case, a prophetess, Ellen G. White. And the Mormons have an origin with a person who was considered a prophet, Joseph Smith. Both of these people, false prophets. Just make no bones about it.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm already learning because that's something I did not know. Of course, when you think about Mormonism, you think about Joseph Smith, you think about Muslim, you think about Muhammad. Yeah. But I did not know that the Seventh-day Adventists had a prophet.
But we're going to go back before Ellen G. White. And so I'm going to share a screen here. And, they're called the Seventh-day Adventists. And so let's see, here comes the. So we talk about Seventh-day Adventist or the Seventh-day Adventist denomination or the Seventh-day Adventism. And in the name, there are two ideas in the name that have to do with really the origins of this denomination. There's the Seventh-day doctrine and then the Adventist doctrine. So the Seventh-day doctrine, of course, has to do with the idea that we're supposed to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, that we're supposed to worship on Saturdays, and just as the Jews did in the Old Testament. That's what they teach. Adventism. Do you have any idea what Adventism refers to?
No, and I'm starting to feel silly because I thought Advent meant to be a proponent of or to regard as important,
advocate.
Something like that.
That's an advocate. You advocate for some idea.
So I've just never slowed down to think about what Adventism means.
Yeah.
So I always thought it just meant that they were advocates of the seventh day, but it's Advent, not advocate.
Adventism. So Advent is a word that means coming. And so we think about Jesus' second advent or his second coming. Now, biblically, you and I are familiar with the fact that in the Bible, there are many comings of the Lord described.
Yeah.
But people talk about when he came into earth as a human being in the first century, that's his first advent or first coming, and then his second coming when he comes in the future at some point. And so Adventism refers to specifically the idea of setting a date for the second coming. The word Advent just means coming, but when you talk about Adventist groups of various sorts, you're usually talking about groups that are focused on setting a date for when they believe this is going to happen. So these are the two big ideas, and we're going to look here. We've got a map on screen And we're going to zoom into this area. That was actually supposed to zoom a little more nicely than that. That just jumped. But that was supposed to fade.
You're not going to make me go through and try and name all those states, are you?
Yeah. Okay. What's this state right here?
Well, that's New York.
All right. We'll start with that. So in Lowhampton, New York, there was a man named William Miller in the early 1800s. Now, William Miller was not a Seventh-day Adventist. The Seventh-day Adventist denomination didn't exist yet. But William Miller was an Adventist in the general sense of the word. He was very much focused on when the Lord would return. And his followers came to be known as Millerites. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have origins that reach back into the Millerite movement. And the Seventh-day Adventists do as well. His influence spread throughout the Northeast. We'll talk about Port Gibson, New York in a little bit. We'll talk about Washington, New Hampshire in a little bit. And we'll talk about Portland, Maine in a little bit. But really, his influence spread all through these states. And then there was another guy down in Massachusetts who was a Sabbatarian. And by way of Washington, New Hampshire, Sabbatarianism, the idea of keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, came to be a part of the doctrine that eventually was promulgated by Ellen G. White in Portland, Maine. So that's kind of just a big picture look at how this all happens. So these two ideas, the Seventh Day and Adventism.
What year are we talking about here?
Well, we're going to be talking about 1843, first of all, because that's the year that in the short period of time running up to 1843, William Miller became convinced that the Lord would return in 1843. Just a word about William Miller. He was a fellow who had become an infidel at one point, and then he spent a couple of years really studying his Bible, and he really got focused on the idea of when Jesus was going to be coming back, Adventism. So let's focus on the Adventist idea. Chase, during this period of time, can you see the date on this newspaper?
1844.
1844, yeah. So this happens to be, we'll come back to this date in a moment, but I was looking through some newspapers of this period of time just to look at accounts of the Millerite movement. And this is unrelated to the Millerite movement, but it was just a little notice in the New York Herald, which was a paper published in New York City, about a lecture that was going to be presented at the Broadway Tabernacle on Broadway in New York City, about the restoration of the Jews. People at this time were interested in the Jews getting their land back. And it says right here in the middle, it says, restoration of the Jews to their ancient heritage and the approach of the millennium. So the millennium refers to 1,000 years, and it's a term that comes from Revelation, the 20th chapter, where it talks about 1,000 years. And the reason I have this on screen is just to say that there was a lot of interest at this period in American history about the millennium, and that the 1,000-year period was soon to begin. That was just a big thing at this period of time in history. And there were a lot of people predicting when it would begin and when the second coming of the Lord would be, which they took, premillennialists, took to be something that would happen at the inauguration of the 1,000 years or the beginning of the millennium. So here's some dates people predicted. Somebody predicted it'd happen in 1835. Somebody else said 1838. Somebody else 1864. Somebody else said 1866. Somebody said
Civil War era.
1870, 1873, 74, 1889. And I say all of that just to say it was a thriving speculation at the time. Yeah.
So, okay, those were the dates people were suspecting back in 1844.
Or throughout this period of time in the early part of the 19th century. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So were they just putting a year on it or a specific day?
Well, often they were putting a year on it, but what we're going to see is eventually it gets fine-tuned by the Millerites to a particular day.
But now, was it numerology, like just looking at numbers in the book of Revelation? Was that a lot of it?
Well, it was, but it was more the book of Daniel. So if you go to the book of Daniel, of course, Daniel is a captive in the captivity that had been prophesied to last for 70 years. In Daniel, the 9th chapter, Daniel becomes aware as he's reading the prophet Jeremiah that God had said this captivity would last 70 years, and Daniel realizes we're at the end of the 70 years. So he's looking for the captivity to come to an end. And an angel speaks to him and tells him, well, there's another 70 weeks decreed, and that's a figurative expression. But Chase, when you read the book of Daniel, and you get to Daniel 9, and it talks about this, well, there's 70 weeks decreed. When would you assume that, and again, that's a figurative number, but when would you assume it begins, this 70 weeks?
You would want to assume from the moment that it's decreed or that it's said or prophesied.
Yeah. And that's at the time that Daniel is observing. We're at the end of the 70 years. And so then there's this angel, and he says, well, there's another 70 weeks decreed. And in the last of these weeks, figuratively speaking, the Messiah is going to be cut off. So what happens is in 539 BC, or 539 years before Christ, the Persians allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the temple. And it's a process that takes place over years. It's kind of a start and stop kind of a thing to it. But most people would say, well, that 70 weeks is you're going to have to start counting that somewhere around 539 BC. But William Miller, in his calculations, he looked at those 70 weeks and he decided they begin not at that time, but they begin in 457 BC. He used Ussher's chronology. Yeah.
Why 457?
Because he used Ussher's chronology, and he took that to be the date that Artaxerxes allowed Nehemiah to go back to check on Jerusalem. It's arbitrary. It's arbitrary. It's not what you read in Daniel, but the number 457 works out for his calculations.
Okay.
So what he does is something like this. There's some variations here, but he begins at 457. He takes the 70 weeks, and he says, well, in the Bible, a day is a year. And so if you have 70 weeks, that'd be 490 days. 70 times 7, right? Be 490. But sure. If a day is a year, then that means 490 years. So this is what he's calculating. So if you add 490 years starting at 457 BC, you come up with 33 AD, which is when Jesus dies on the cross. But that's if you start at 457.
Right.
All right. Besides that, though, if you take the 2300 days mentioned in Daniel 8, so let's go back to Daniel 8. In Daniel, the 8th chapter, in verse 14, if you get there before I do, the context here is the ram and the goat that represent Persia and Greece respectively. And do you have Daniel 8:14 perchance?
He said to me, for 2,300 evenings, that's 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored.
Yeah. So this is talking about this horn. If we back up just a little bit, there's a small horn which becomes very great in verse 9, a horn on this goat, apparently representing Antiochus Epiphanes. And it talks about the period of the desecration of the temple under Antiochus Epiphanes and counts that as 2,300 days. Now, keep in mind, Chase, we know this, in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation and in various places in the Bible, numbers have symbolic significance. You're not necessarily supposed to count literally 2,300 days. But Miller did. And he said, if you take the day for a year principle again, and you assume that 2,300 days is 2,300 years, and then if you add that to 457 BC, you come out to 1843. And so he concluded this means the Lord is supposed to return in 1843, specifically sometime between March of 1843 and March of 1844. So he had a lot of followers all over the Northeast, and they would gather and talk about this. There are newspaper accounts of it. But March of 1844 came and went, and nothing happened. So there was some disappointment. What's going on here? But a guy named Samuel Snow, he recalculated. And he said, you know what? We should be looking to the 7th month, the Day of Atonement of the 7th month, which would be October 22nd, 1944. He says, that's when it should happen. So now you asked earlier, did they predict a particular day? So they did.
Okay.
All right. So
they're like a GPS. When you miss your turn, they just
recalculating. Yeah, recalculating. Okay. So people talk about this as the great disappointment. And I've heard stories about people going out in their white robes and standing on top of their barns and waiting for the Lord to return.
Really?
And yeah. Now, how much of that is accurate and how much of that is exaggeration and hyperbole, I don't know, and I've wondered sometimes. So I went back and started looking at the newspaper accounts. And yeah, there are newspaper accounts. This is from the Liberator, which was a Boston, Massachusetts newspaper. And what's the date?
October 25th, 1844.
So this is 3 days after this was supposed to have happened. If you go to page 4 under miscellany, so it wasn't the front page news, but we have somebody who's writing actually
Sorry. If it had happened, it would have been on page 1, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is a letter that was actually, first of all, published in the Boston Courier. Lydia Maria Child was a fairly well-known person of the time, an activist, an abolitionist, and a writer. And, you know, Chase, I don't know if you've ever spent any time looking at the newspapers of the 1800s, but it's in the letters to the editors that you learn so much.
Yeah, I've never done this before. It's making me want to, though. This is really cool.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, one time I went down to a library on the shore of Lake Erie out east of Cleveland and went through some old newspapers from the 1800s and found Thomas Campbell writing a letter to the editor about Joseph Smith and his movement and the problems with them, because they were over in the area just south and southeast, I think, mostly south of where this newspaper was published.
Wow.
That's interesting. Well, anyway, she writes and she talks about this idea that the Lord, now she's writing in the Courier a little bit before October 22nd, and this newspaper, what was the name of it? The Liberator, picked it up from the Courier and they publish it now. And there's another little blurb also under miscellany on this same day, and it's another letter to the editor. I'll just read the first few lines here. Mr. Editor, a case of lunacy arising out of the pernicious doctrines of Millerism occurred last evening at the residence of a leading Millerite in Cambridgeport. Cambridgeport is a little neighborhood in Cambridge, which is right there in Boston near Harvard University. And my only motive in giving it publicly through your columns is that the community may be apprised of some of the evil results of Mr. Himes' excitement in this city and consider what may be proper for them to do to arrest the further progress of such an abominable and dangerous delusion. He goes on to discuss a group of Millerites in a house that were making all kind of ruckus, really loud stuff, and a guy carrying on like some Pentecostals or charismatics would do today. And he talks about all that. But here's what I want to call attention to. Between these two notices, you have accounts of a man who had an apple stall in Boston, and he gave away all his fruits and cakes because he's going to go out of business because the Lord's going to return within days. Does this remind you of 2 Thessalonians at all? People who've read 1 Thessalonians and Paul talking about the Lord's coming, and then 2 Thessalonians, he has to tell them, hey, quit being busybodies. If a man will not work, neither let him eat. Don't be going around and being busybodies with nothing to do for yourself, you know.
Yeah. So the implication sometimes is maybe they quit their jobs, or maybe they were just being lazy because they were anticipating the Lord's coming. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Well, and in this case, and I'd heard about people quitting their jobs and selling their possessions and whatnot, but or giving them away. But in this case, we have a couple of letters to the editor where they're giving accounts of this real time. There was a vendor of stoves in Boston who shut up his shop and announced that no more stoves would be needed on this earth.
All right.
There was a shoemaker in Division Street who began to give away all his stock. He's just giving away his shoes. And there was a shop in the Bowery where they mounted a placard, muslin for ascension robes, so that you could make your robes for ascending. Now, the writer who mentioned this one, she said, she didn't know if this was just somebody making fun of them, or putting that sign out, or if it was somebody seeing a business opportunity, or if it was somebody who was in all seriousness. She didn't know. But nonetheless, this is kind of the spirit of the time. And there was a painter mentioned who just gave up his business because he thought the Lord was about to return. So this is kind of the spirit of the time. So that's really interesting. Do you remember some in recent decades, couple of times there's been somebody who kind of got a little notoriety predicting a specific date the Lord was supposed to return?
Can I remember someone doing that?
Yeah, you may have been pretty young. There was a guy named Camp or something like that about 15 years ago who was doing that sort of thing.
Well, yeah. And of course, in 2012, the Mayan calendar ran out, and so there was that. But not other than that, Jeff, I can't remember anyone. I think people have mostly stopped doing this.
Somebody will come along and do it again.
Oh, what am I saying? I'm sorry, Jeff. No, there's someone. There's actually a guy that I was just talking to my sister about, who predicted the end of the world a few months ago now.
Okay.
And he's very prominent. He has a very big YouTube following. I actually started to watch one of his videos, but if I'm being honest, it was a little hard to watch. But his name is, let's see here. And as you can imagine, the name of his video, this one in particular, was the Red Horse War. The Red Horse is loose.
Oh, yeah.
Jamie Walden is his name.
Jamie Walden. I have to look him up.
He has 44,000 subscribers on YouTube.
Wow.
But he predicted the end of the world just a few months ago.
Well, William Miller was getting a big following in the 1800s without YouTube, and it was affecting people in various communities. And one of those communities was in Port Gibson, New York, and there were some Millerites there. And so October 22nd, they were all gathered together, waiting for the Lord's return, and it didn't happen. So Hiram Edson, who was one of those people, was very disappointed, and he walked out and he went to himself to pray. And then he decided he'd gained some strength from praying, and so he's going to go back and try to shore up everybody else. But then he and a couple of the others walked across the cornfield neighboring his place, and as they were walking through the cornfield, he suddenly got it. He got a vision, and he understood. It wasn't that the date was wrong, it was that they misunderstood what was going to happen. They had the idea the Lord was going to leave his heavenly tabernacle and come to earth. But Hiram Edson, it dawned on him, no, that's not what was supposed to happen on October 22nd, 1844. What was supposed to happen is, and did happen, is Jesus went from the holy place to the most holy place. In other words, like this. Here's our tabernacle diagram.
Yeah.
You see the courtyard and the two rooms of the tabernacle there in the tent area. Inside, you've got the lampstand over here, and the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. And here would be the veil, and then this would be where the Ark of the Covenant is. Well, his idea was that what actually happened on this date is, in 1844, October 22nd, Jesus went from the first room to the second room.
So hang on. So is he borrowing imagery from the latter part of Ezekiel to get a temple vision in his head? Where is he?
I don't know how much he thought of Ezekiel. He seems to be thinking of Leviticus 16.
Oh, well, I know that, but
Yeah.
clearly he would believe that temple, that veil was torn in two and destroyed.
Yeah.
So in his mind, there is a temple in heaven where Jesus crossed from there to the most holy of holies.
Yeah, and if you think of Hebrews 9 and the contrast between the earthly sanctuary, the earthly tabernacle, and the heavenly tabernacle.
Okay, yeah.
So that's what he's doing, except he's trying to correlate the remember, this is all supposed to be the Day of Atonement event. The guy who said, Samuel Snow, who said, oh, no, the reason it didn't happen before March of 1844 is supposed to be the Day of Atonement, 7th month, October 22nd, 1844. So they're trying to correlate this with the priest going into the most holy place now in Leviticus 16, the Jewish Day of Atonement. And so they're saying, well, that was an earthly representation of what Jesus is doing in heaven. He's going from one room to the other in 1844. Now, okay. I see a fundamental problem with this if we think of what the priest going into the most holy place actually represents. And I think you'll probably see the same thing. What does it actually represent?
Making atonement for the people, which Jesus already did.
And when did he do it?
When he died.
When he died, 1844 years before 1844.
Which is the point that the Hebrew writer makes.
Exactly. So on the Day of Atonement, the high priest was supposed to go into the second room with a bull's blood. And in Hebrews, the 9th chapter, let's see, are we going to run out of time? We got time. Let's go over to Hebrews, the 9th chapter. Let's go over to Hebrews, the 9th chapter, and let's look at verses 6 through 11 here. And I'll tell you what. So in the first 5 verses, the writer has talked about the earthly tabernacle and the various furnishings of the earthly tabernacle. And then starting in verse 6, he talks about the events of the Day of Atonement when the high priest would go into the second room. And so, Chase, if you would, take us from Hebrews 9, verse 6, and read right through verse 11.
These things,
go ahead.
With these things prepared like this, the priests enter the first room repeatedly, performing their ministry. But the high priest alone enters the second room, and he does that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was making it clear that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed while the first tabernacle was still standing. This is a symbol for the present time, during which gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the worshiper's conscience. They are physical regulations and only deal with food, drink, and various washings imposed until the time of the new order. But Christ has appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, in the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation.
So clearly the writer says there's a correlation. There's something that is being represented by this high priest going into the second room. And he correlates it to what Christ did when he offers himself as a sacrifice. And of course, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 8 makes the point that the fact that the high priest could never go in there except one day out of the year was to represent the idea that at that time, the way into the presence of God was not yet open. What happened when Jesus died on the cross in Matthew 27, verses 50 and 51? Jesus, with a loud voice, gave up the spirit, yielded up his spirit. He dies. And then verse 51, what happens in the temple?
The veil of the temple is torn in two.
Veil of the temple is torn in two. What's that about? It's saying that the way which was not yet open is now opened. Jesus opens this way when he dies on the cross and takes away our sins, makes the sacrifice.
Yeah. You might include verse 12 in this too, because it goes on to say, he entered the most holy place once for all, not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. That's all past tense, correct?
I will. That's good. I'll change this and add verse 12 there. So I think we're getting the point made fairly clearly here that the Day of Atonement is pointing to what Jesus did on the cross. Instead of bull's blood, he shed his own blood. So let's come down and get chapter 9, verses 12 through 14 now.
You've already got it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but get 13 through 14.
For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a young cow, sprinkling those who are defiled, sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse our consciences from dead works so that we can serve the living God?
This is not about something that happened in 1844. This is something that happened when Jesus died on the cross. And so it mentions goat here. So there was also, back in the Old Testament, a goat that was sacrificed. There were two goats, actually. We'll talk about the other one in a minute. But the priest had to come in with the bull's blood, and then he had to come in with the goat's blood. And yet Jesus sheds his own blood. When does he do that? Not in 1844. and he offers that sacrifice. The priest would come in and sprinkle the goat's blood and the bull's blood in front of and on the mercy seat. And that corresponds to Jesus offering his own blood, which he did on the cross. And then go ahead.
Nope, no, you're good.
Let's get verses 24 through 26.
Sure. Still chapter 9.
Yeah.
For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. He did not do this to offer himself many times, as the high priest enters the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself.
This is all about the sacrifice of himself. This is all about Jesus dying on the cross and offering his blood. It goes on in chapter 10 and talks about the blood of bulls and goats doesn't really take away sin. Jesus' sacrifice did. We mentioned the goat. In Leviticus 16, where it talks about the activities of the Day of Atonement and the bull's blood and the goat's blood, it also mentions another goat that they took that other goat, a living goat, put their hands on the head of the goat to lay the sins of the people on the goat, and sent the goat away into the wilderness. And I always think of the 103rd Psalm in verse 12, where it talks about our sins being removed as far from us as the east is from the west. So Jesus dies on the cross, and you can think about what he accomplishes in a couple of ways. One, he dies and sheds his blood as an atonement for our sins. Two, the result of that is taking our sins away from us. And so you have these two goats, and together, one dies, his blood is offered, the other one is sent away into the wilderness. Together, they represent those two ideas. So clearly, the Day of Atonement is not about 1844. It's about what Jesus did in the first century. There's another little thing, and we've talked about this before on this webcast. What did the priest leave in the tabernacle?
Garments.
Yeah, that's in Leviticus 16. He's to go back in, take off the garments that he wore throughout this ritual, and leave them there. And what did Jesus, when Jesus was raised from the dead, what did he leave behind? What did the people find when they went into the tomb?
Folded were his wrappings, his linen wrappings.
Yeah, and Luke mentions it in Luke 23. John describes it in John chapter 20, the linen wrappings lying there and the face cloth and all left lying there. And so you just see the parallels. What Jesus did 2,000 years ago, not in 1844, is the fulfillment of what we read in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. So Jesus sacrificed 2,000 years ago. It's what's in view, not 1844. But what Hiram Edson did when he was walking through that cornfield, he decided that what was supposed to happen in 1844 on October 22nd is Jesus went from the first room to the second room. Well, he just misunderstood the symbolism of all of that. All right, some observations, Chase.
Well, okay. I thought you were asking me for
Yeah,
observations.
if you got one, go ahead. I've got a 2 or 3 here, but if you've got one,
my head is just spinning. So he said that's when Jesus moved from the holy place to the most holy of holies. Did he go on to say when he's coming back? Did they ever repredict it?
No, they've got a thing called the investigative judgment that they believe Jesus is doing now. But to my knowledge, they've not come up with a new date as to when he's going to come back. I think maybe they kind of got burned on the date setting just a little bit.
Okay, so what is their religion about, since now they don't do that?
Well, Sabbatarianism is still a big part of it, certainly.
Sure.
Some aspects of the law, like the food regulations, we'll talk a little bit about that. But let me make just some observations, just on the basis of the history we've looked at so far, and that is the danger of speculative religion. Have you ever? I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I have various times seen brethren, Christians, who just get hung up on some novel interpretation of the Bible, some doctrine that they've decided to believe. Nobody else teaches this. It's not something that's been historically taught or understood, but they kind of come up with something, and all of a sudden they just become all about that. And especially people tend to do this in regard to things the Bible doesn't tell us, like when's Jesus coming again.
Do you mean things that sound like myths or empty speculation or things like that?
Yeah. Where were you coming up with that kind of language, Chase?
That's 1 Timothy 1.
Yeah. And Paul is there talking, I believe he's talking about the Gnostic speculations. They did a lot of speculating about, they got into speculating about angels being married to angels and what their names were and what angel begat what angel and those kind of genealogies and things. And they let me see if I can get rid of
it. As you're doing that, yeah, so in that verse, don't pay attention to myths, endless genealogies. These promote empty speculations rather than God's plan, which operates by faith. And then verse 6, some have departed from these and turned aside to fruitless discussion.
Yeah.
There's no substance to anything you're saying or talking about.
So we should be wary of getting hung up on speculations, especially about things that the Bible has not told us, just speculations that something that's left open-ended in the Bible. Now we're going to speculate all about it, and we get hung up on it, and then you'll see somebody start a religion. And anytime you have a religion based on a unique, novel interpretation, that's a danger. One of the things I think about, there are people who say, well, you guys are strange. You don't use instrumental music. That may seem strange to some people today, but if you look over the course of history, that is not an unusual understanding of the Bible. That's actually the usual understanding of the Bible. People say, well, you're strange. You believe that baptism is necessary for the remission of sins. That's not an unusual teaching. If you look over the last 2,000 years, that's pretty usual. That's kind of what people have generally understood. We may be living in a time and a place where in our little circle, it seems like those are unusual things. But when somebody comes up with something that is truly unique, truly novel, as in unprecedented, and then they start a religion based on that, well, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Danger of agenda-driven Bible study. They had the idea that Jesus had to be coming back somewhere around 1843, 1844. And so they're going to look at these different passages that mention different numbers and dates, and they're going to find numbers that fit their conclusion. If they have to start with 457 instead of 539, they'll start with 457 if that'll make their conclusion come out right. And then when it doesn't come out right, and it didn't happen in 1843 or before March of 1844, we've still got to be right. Maybe we're just off by what month it is. So, okay, he is coming, but it's got to be the Day of Atonement. And then when that doesn't happen, you say, no, we're still right. It did happen. We just misunderstood what was going to happen. It was October 22nd, 1844, but it was just he went from one room to the other instead of coming back to the earth. It's kind of like they have their conclusion. Jesus is coming. This is the date. Now we just got to make everything fit it.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. You can back me off if you think I should, but I'm not saying this guy is the man of lawlessness. But there are some principles from that section in 2 Thessalonians 2 that I think are helpful when you talk about these religions that are trying to predict the day of Jesus. Because that's what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 2. Now, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to be easily upset or troubled, either by prophecy or by message or a letter supposedly from us, alleging that the day of the Lord has come. Don't let anyone deceive you in this way. There's a principle there, at least. I'm not saying that this guy is the man of lawlessness.
Right.
Hey, don't get caught up in this kind of stuff.
Right. Exactly. Well, let's just we got just a couple minutes here. We got about 6 minutes here. Let's take this a little further. So what happened was there were some Millerites over in Washington, New Hampshire. They were buying into this idea that Jesus is coming back in 1844. There's a fellow down in Massachusetts named Joseph Bates. He was a shipmaster, a ship owner, and a mariner, and he became convinced of the Sabbath, that the seventh-day Sabbath is what we ought to be doing. And he had influence with this group up here in New Hampshire, and they had bought into the Millwright doctrine. And then both of those ideas worked their way over to Ellen G. White, a woman who had a lot of health issues, and she started having visions, or at least saying she did, and became regarded as a prophetess. And so she is considered, she along with Joseph Bates, are the founding fathers of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. But what you see here is the Millwright influence and the Sabbatarian influence coming together in Ellen G. White, and then you get the Seventh-day Adventist Church, those two ideas, Seventh-day Adventism, combined.
Okay.
So, Snow is the fellow who said, maybe it's got to be the 7th month. It's got to be October 22nd, 1844, instead of sometime before March of 1844. Snow was of Puritan stock. And Bates also, he'd been on a ship where it was an English ship, and the people on the board the ship were forced to worship according to the Church of England practices. There's some important background right here. Chase, in the Puritans who came over from England, we call them the Pilgrims, but they were Puritans. What do you know about their reasons for having left England and gone to the Netherlands or Holland, and then having left there and come to the New World? What do you remember about their reasons?
Well, okay. So freedom of religion, right? That was the big thing they wanted.
Exactly right. So what it was in England in this period of time, going back in the 1600s and on into the 1700s, you had the Church of England, which was very ritualistic, and also it was the official state church. The king is the head of the Church of England.
Yeah. We wanted the separation of state and church.
They had laws that you had to worship according to the prescriptions of the Church of England. And there were people who had a more spiritual concept of the kingdom of Christ, of the church. And they resisted that, and they were looking for an opportunity to worship according to their conscience. In this period of time in American history in the early 1800s, you still got some residual chafing against Anglicanism. And Anglicanism, the Church of England, is really kind of a Protestant version of Roman Catholicism.
Right, because it started Henry VIII, correct?
Yeah. He wanted
Catholic Church told him you can't divorce your wife, and he said, "Well, I'll just start my own church."
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the Anglican Church, and to a great extent, this is really true of the Roman Catholic Church also, they had a lot of rituals that reflect a Jewish mentality. If you think of the robes of the priests, and you think of all the lighting of candles and the burning of incense and all of those things. In the Anglican Church, their concept was the New Testament church is simply a new version of the Old Testament worship system with some tweaks to help things out. Instead of circumcising our kids, which is a little gruesome, we'll just baptize them. Instead of having the seventh day be our Sabbath day, we'll just change the Sabbath day to the first day of the week, Sunday. And so in their mindset, Sunday is the, quote, Christian Sabbath. Have you ever heard anybody say that?
I have. I definitely have.
You and I grew up in areas where that was kind of a popular concept. The Sabbath day they thought of as Sunday.
Yes.
Yeah. And the New Testament does not teach that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. It is the Lord's Day. And I will talk a little bit about the distinction between the two in a moment. But that idea that Sunday is just kind of the Sabbath day changed to Sunday, it's not from the Bible. And so that was an opportunity for some of these people. We're about out of time. I'm gonna have to do this real quick. I'll tell you what, we're gonna have to leave this here, Chase. But what I want to say is this. I'm going to save it for next week. How about we pick up with this next week and we talk
I would
about
actually really enjoy that. I think that'd be fun.
All right, we'll do that. We'll pick up with this next week. Thanks for listening, y'all. I hope maybe some of you have found this interesting. Again, the point is not just to pick on some denomination, but it's kind of to learn some lessons about what goes awry that leads to a lot of the religious confusion that's in the world today. And maybe that's helpful. So thank you for listening. And Lord willing, we'll be with you again next week at 3 p.m. for Bible Quest. All right. Thank you, Chase.